I'd like to call your attention to the Twitter hashtag. A number of people were taking notes last time. Can I see a show of hands how many people saw this last year? Excellent. So one of the feedback comments that we received was that they forgot, they had this great idea for a new question and they forgot what it is. So the hashtag is there at the bottom of that chart on the right. You can see it's hashtag CAIC17. So if something just strikes you, you can tweet it out this morning and we'll be sure and capture it in the results. If you want to wait until the end, you can also drop your business card off at the registration desk along with a list of questions that you'd like to see added to the survey next year. So there were a number of improvements that we put in place this year for the data set. It's much larger. Last year we had 1,800 total surveys. We had over 10,000 this year. We got a lot better regional coverage, and with the help of the sponsors, we were able to upgrade the technology, operating the dashboards, and manage this level of detail. So what's new? Last year, we were really surprised how highly green features scored in terms of tenant preferences. So this year, we got a lot more granular in terms of what does that mean? Is that energy efficiency or is that certifications? What's it mean? We also had an individual section to assess landlord satisfaction. There's some really great data there. We also improved the tech granularity, meaning asking people about how do you like to pay, how do you like to do your service calls, how does all that work, and what technology do you need in your unit. We increased the number of parking questions because this is really important in terms of public policymakers. And we added multiple parameters to our data assessment tools, and I'll show you that next. So we upgraded the dashboard, and there's basically two main dashboards. The one in the upper left is where you take a specific characteristic. This is a question. This question is just randomly selected. It's would you pay more to be able to pay your rent with a credit card? And then you can bifurcate it. In this case, it's bifurcated by gender, but you could do that by location. You could do it by urban versus suburban. There's a lot of toggle features in that dashboard. The one on the right is where you are giving rankings. So we changed the assessment. We had it 1 to 5 last year, and that gets 1 degree of granularity. What we thought would be more helpful for the landlord community in particular is what things are totally essential and what things are important. And that distinction is right at the cutting edge in terms of what do you have to spend money on versus what would you like to spend money on. And it's interesting because there's some difference between where the market stands and what the tenants think are essential. And in that data is where people can get competitive advantage. So this granularity has the same features in that you can divide it by gender, by location, by age, all the different things that you might want to slice and dice if you're putting together your package for a new development project, or if you're an asset manager who has a little bit of discretionary money for a CapEx improvement or a service delivery in terms of selecting for your region, for your competitive set, and for the age and demographics of your specific renters. Where do you get the biggest bang for the buck? What are people willing to pay more money for? And what leads to higher tenant retention? So, on to the findings. Transit scored really well last year, but it scored even better this year. And in fact, there were a very high percentage of respondents who said access to transit was essential. High-speed internet scored great last year, scored even higher this year. And non-smoking was an example of a question that we added that wasn't previously discussed. Commute times, amazingly, are falling. And we suspect that's because fewer people are driving, but that would be a question that we could ask next year. Last year, Vancouver was the hardest place to find a unit. This year, the wait times to find a unit were longer in Toronto. And we found very, very interesting information that's detailed in the green section later on. Because we had more communities and because we had a lot more suburban responses, and we also had responses from cities such as London and Kitchener and Victoria, where transit isn't as available, we did see an increase in the interest and the willingness to pay extra for parking. We also found that young renters are overwhelmingly looking for their units online. This matches the data that we see in the US, and we're seeing a rising focus on health and wellness features. Moving on to the data set, so you can assess how representative this information really is. So, you can see on the right is the total data set, and 22% of the data came from cities that aren't on that list. The 15 cities that are most important from an institutional standpoint are the ones that we culled the data set to, because you had a lot of units in places like Belleville or remoter sections of Quebec where the building only had 4 units and really wasn't in a position to fund the kinds of amenities that we really wanted to understand. So these 15 cities are the data set that I'll be presenting. In terms of the age breakdown, as would be expected, about a third of the renters, just a little more, were between the ages of 30 and 40, which are considered the prime rental years. But surprisingly, over 30% of the renters are over 50. And while the next chart talks about the 50 to 70 band, I'd like to call your attention to the 70 to 90 band, which is almost 10% of the renters in Canada. We talked about this last year in terms of the affordability issues. We didn't deal with affordability at the same granularity this year, but interestingly, that is the population that is on fixed income and for whom all of these trends that we just saw with Benjamin and with Scott are the biggest problem. So we also did not go out and target senior housing facilities or student housing facilities. So these are people who are just in the regular rental market who are responding to our survey online. So demographically, we had slightly more female respondents. Typically, the largest block of respondents, the center of the bell curve, was the largest single block of renters. This is a reasonably well-to-do group with a majority of the people in the $50,000 to $100,000 range. We made the small cutoff at under $50,000. In order to do an affordability graph, we actually need to break that into more categories, which we will be doing next year. The reason why that doesn't add up to 100, by the way, is because one of the options they had would be prefer not to disclose, and that was about 20% of the responses. So most people are living in a purpose-built apartment, and interestingly, a little more than a third of the people have pets. So in terms of the inventory itself, this was a little different than last year. Again, most of the condo stock that's in rental is in Vancouver or Toronto, more so in Vancouver than Toronto. And in cities like Ottawa, a much higher percentage than on average is actually in purpose-built rentals, and that reflects the larger market size of Vancouver and Toronto. So interestingly, half of all renters in Canada are married or consider themselves married for legal purposes. In the States, the renter population is about 75% single people. So that's a distinction in terms of how they think about it. You also have a larger family component of the rental business in Canada than you do in the United States. And most people, 2/3, reported that their income is up year over year. So that's part of the reason that the rents are rising successfully and tenant retention is so high. I was just reviewing the multi-housing report on the key trends in the United States, and the third largest reason why people are renting units in the United States is the community feeling. So the socialization, the activities organized, and the community newsletters, those types of factors, and that will not show up in our data here. And I think it's a matter of the difference between the high percentage of married residents in Canada versus the high percentage of singles in America. So again, this happened last year. A majority of the survey respondents rent 2 or larger bedrooms, and there's clearly a lot more demand for larger units than we have coming in the supply. Second box about the bathtub. Since 3/4 of the units only have 1 bathroom, pretty much everybody who has a child with them needs a bathtub. And there are a number of people, especially in the senior column, who also required a bathtub. So as you're thinking about those incremental amenities, if you only have 1 bathroom, having a bathtub makes a big difference. The would not rent without, the highest scores were internet, same as last year. Parking lot, that was a new one. The price is the most important signing factor, and living near transit, again, topped the list in terms of locational features. So let's dig into the data. The trends. So almost half of the people said they would pay more for amenities that they don't have. And that data you can get very granular about in terms of what specific amenities and how much people will pay for in the survey. In terms of the most highly rated green features, these are illustrated here. We were very surprised by the smart thermostat results. Only 5% of people said that that was essential, but 50% of the survey responders said they want a smart thermostat and that that itself is important. I think recycling is definitely a community attribute that people responded to. Lighting surprised us also, and certifications, I think that is something that is visibly demonstrative, and the tenants responded strongly to that. So as with last year, a high percentage of people reported that they intend to stay where they are. And the great news on this page is about the satisfaction ratings. So we scored satisfaction from 1 to 10, and 70% of the respondents gave a score between 5 and 9, saying that they are very satisfied. So congratulations to all of you who operate apartments. So why are people staying? Location outpulled all the other columns by double. Value was next. Now, people say they make their decisions based on price and then location, but location is stickier than price. And as happened last year, the trade-off of location or price against size is definitely showing up in the data again this year. Last year, we didn't poll for quality property management, but that made the list. And there are things that are below this. Pets scored here very well, and there's a little more data about that later on. So we asked this year, why are you renting versus owning? In order to get a feeling for whether most renters are doing that as a lifestyle choice or they're doing it because of cost essentialness. And the answer is 30% of the respondents previously did own a home, and so that explains the first couple of points here, and these are in descending order of respondents. And we also asked the question about, do you have a preference for living in a condo community or an apartment community? And that information has a lot of texture to it when you're going from one city to the next, because obviously in Ottawa that's not really very feasible. There's not very many condo units in the rental stock. But in Toronto there was a strong preference for it, and in Vancouver also. So these listed almost exactly the same way they did last year. Price is way more important than everything else, although location matters a lot. Next year, we want to get into more details on the design features from the lobby entrance and the overall architecture of the building, because we haven't really polled for that at all yet. And management and property owners is lower on the list. So I would have to conclude that that means that those factors are not a problem, but it's also a branding opportunity for those of you who have large portfolios and want to use that as moving up the ladder. So the rental information is consistent also with the two presentations we just saw. Affordability is diminishing. And the largest single grouping in terms of this bell curve was suburban apartments in the 1,200 to 1,500 band. That's what is perfectly typical in Canada. All of the higher priced units are going up rapidly. So cars, more good news here. More people reported that they don't have cars, even though we had way more survey responses from the suburbs this year. Now, as you look at the cities, there's a lot of difference one way and the other, and obviously suburban residents reported significantly more cars than urban residents, but that just indicates how much the urban departure from car ownership is increasing and trending. So commutes. Public transit scored number 1 again, driving number 2, and that reflects the suburban stock, and walk, which is predominantly a Vancouver phenomenon, also increased. Bike, Uber, taxi, more renters are Ubering than taxiing, which I thought was interesting, and more are biking than Ubering or taxiing. That's also interesting. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. So commute times. We thought we'd just perk this up a little bit with some video feeds. So commute times are going down, which is not my personal experience, and I don't know how many of you are having this experience, but clearly renters are moving in order to get closer to work and to reduce the amount of time they have to spend on transit or in a car. So that's all good news. And obviously the commutes are longer in Toronto because we have a larger geography here than the other cities of Canada, but all across the survey, people indicated that their commute time is going down. So let's move on to market dynamics. Good news is that the time to find a rental went down. More people reported they were able to get that done in a month, and fewer were taking 2 to 6 months. And the biggest delta in the actual year-over-year numbers was in Vancouver. So in Vancouver, this is why it became more difficult in Toronto than Vancouver, is because a lot more inventory was delivered in Vancouver into the rental market. Now, another piece of really interesting information is year over year, the number of people finding their rental through online services jumped about 12 basis points, and 35%, or 1/3 of all the people reported that the primary method they used for finding their rental was an online service, and that may actually help reduce the time. So something to think about, important to have a presence there. Again, the timelines that people are staying in their units are going up. The exception was in the 3 to 5 year band. I like to think of that as a time where people have gotten a little bit of savings together, maybe for a down payment, and might be looking at making a purchase decision. When you look at the satisfaction data across the length of time data, there's still a very high level of satisfaction among the people who are in the 3 to 5 year band, and that helped us move our thinking about why that specific duration slot is dropping, to attribute it to home ownership. So drilling down on satisfaction, I think the satisfaction numbers were excellent. There's clearly room for improvement. Those 20% rated 1 through 5 are probably in the camp of probably a look around. The satisfaction level in Vancouver was quite a bit higher than Toronto, so if you are a Vancouver landlord, pat yourself on the back. If you're here in Toronto, this is an area where there's room for improvement. Same with recommendations to friends. So plans for 12 months, this is consistent with last year's data, except that the number of people planning to purchase is dropping, and that's clearly reflecting the affordability issues, and in Toronto and Vancouver, some of the supply constraints that are being imposed by the provincial policies. So of those that are looking to move, 49% would like to stay in their current location, which again suggests that this is about being priced out of your unit, not about dissatisfaction. On to unit features. So, second year in a row, high-speed internet was the #1 thing people were looking for. In the US data about how people made decisions, this made #3, not #1, but there's probably more facilities that are providing it in the US because of the socialization aspects that I discussed earlier. Patios scored well in terms of their essentialness, but these figures change when you add both essential and important, and we thought that that granularity was really interesting. This bathtub data tells you a little bit more granularity about who specifically was indicating that they must have a bathtub. So really interesting that what wasn't considered important, and we checked about 40 different attributes here, was very, very consistent. It was consistent across all age groups, incomes, satisfaction levels, and whether or not people had a dependent, which is interesting because those seniors that were in the bar, that 10% that are over 70, don't seem to be needing accessibility accommodations, and when they do, they just move into senior housing. So I thought that was very interesting information. This is a list of the range of features surveyed. There were actually about 15 more than this, but we wanted to touch on ones that are most common for the purposes of this presentation, and I know it's really hard to read even in this granular. But what I wanted to show you is that the difference, generally speaking, things that are essential are also important, but you can see that the ordination is a little different, and I gave you the example earlier of the thermostats. And those smart thermostats are 5% essential, and almost 50% said it was important. So sometimes there's a big delta in those columns, and that's why looking at essential and important is also valuable. So in this column, you see that it's more important to people to not have to hear their neighbors than to have high-speed internet access. But these and a patio are really, really important. I think increasingly garbage disposals and washer dryers are being considered must-haves, not nice-to-haves. Although where I live in Mississauga, garbage disposals are illegal. So I don't know what you do about that. Bathtubs also scored higher than we expected. So these are all about essential lifestyle features, whereas the unit layouts and features scored less well than the sort of essential operational horsepower of the unit. So this is an abbreviated list of what tenants would pay more for. If you do get the survey, you'll get an indication of how much people were willing to pay for these things. For sure, overwhelmingly, renovated bathrooms and kitchens are what it's all about, and part of that is just adding amenities like dishwashers. In Toronto, new cabinets and cupboards, and I think that probably reflects the higher amount of supply delivery here in Toronto, and especially the condo availability. So, on to location. This was very similar to last year. You'll remember how highly the grocery store charged, but public transit actually outscored it in terms of the essential category. And this was really different when you were looking at suburban versus urban renters. Here we go. So generally speaking, these features fall in the same order: transit, grocery, place of work, outdoor spaces, restaurants, and schools. That's sort of the order. And nightlife was brought up the rear in both downtown residents as well as suburban residents. But the degree to which these things are essential, it varies. Because I think if you live in the suburbs, you're at least twice as likely to have a car. And so the proximity to transit and a grocery store is still important, but it's not so critical as it is if you live downtown and you're carrying your groceries home. So features. Now you can see that these feature numbers are a little lower than the amenity, or the prior section, in terms of the horsepower of the units. And we were surprised that parking lot came out number one. Now, we didn't have it on the option list last year, and the reason that we wanted to really search for this is as a policymaker tool, because we made the observation last year that with 50% of the residents not owning a car, that is an income opportunity for owners to check how full are their parking structures and maybe offering paid parking for free. And sure enough, it did show up that a significant percentage of tenants would pay more to get additional parking. So I highly recommend that you mind that particular subset. Fitness facilities certainly scored very well, but we were surprised recycling scored as well as fitness did. Storage was the next major category that had a lot of take-up among both important and essential. So green features and certifications did rate higher than parking in common areas, which I think is wonderful, personally, being eco-oriented as I am. And we added parcel services because we just really wanted to see about the take-up in e-commerce, and this is something that we also see spiking in the United States, where they're having to set up customized parcel reception areas and sometimes refrigerated. There's a lot of information here coming up about how that looks, but it scored very well. When you get the essential and the important items together, you get priorities of safety and convenience, followed by green and storage. And clearly, as the units get smaller and smaller, storage becomes increasingly important. But it's not as important as the green features to these renters. So it's not important. BAS just stands for Buildings as a Service, and this is back to that comment I made earlier about the big distinction between the community life in the US apartment communities and what's going on here in Canada. People are not interested in having a business center and using their apartment for work. They're not interested in having social, programmed social functions. And they're not even that interested in bike sharing or personal shopping services or car sharing, which those are green features that did not get a high take-up. Services such as pickup and delivery, that's very common in high-end apartments in the States, and it's very popular. That rated third on their must-have list. But it's just not important to any of our survey responders across all age bands and all cities. So I thought it was curious that given that a third of the renters are pet owners, that there wasn't more take-up for things such as dog grooming stations, which is another amenity that we're seeing in the high-end segment in the US, especially in the urban sector, because it's difficult to wash your dogs if you don't have a custom dog station. And so we did toggle it, and you can see that pets are evenly split across all age groups and evenly split between dogs and cats. So there's definitely a sector of the market that is very pet-oriented, and if you wanted to make that a point of distinction in your community, a third of all renters would respond to that. So in conclusion for this section, the top 3 items are related to amenities. The second 3 items are related to location characteristics, and the bottom 3 items are related to what are the things that people would pay the most additional rent to get. So in sum, these were the most important conclusions of the renter preference section. Okay, so we promised last year that we'd drill down more on technology. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Gartner. It's a technology consulting firm, and they do all kinds of interesting things. They're most well known for the hype curve, which is where they talk about where on the curve of adoption radical disruptive technologies are. They've been doing a lot of research on the transition in terms of how people market, the effectiveness of marketing, and how consumers make choices. And what they're finding is the single most important way in which people are researching products and projects and rental units and all things is online. This is highly, highly consistent, and most people spend more time working on digital channels before they actually go out the door and use some shoe leather. Then obviously face-to-face interactions or touching and feeling the product is important, but then they go back into researching again. So all of this, and you know, we hear these comments about millennials, or it's more important to them what their peers think than what the actual attributes of the product are. That's not so true. I think they're using the internet very comprehensively, but most of all, they're doing it to do the research before they even go out the door to get started. So how this works is that they've mapped it across the buying cycle. So initially, double the number of people are going online to find out basic information about what it is they're looking to purchase than looking at social media or videos. Now, these numbers are really high. We're talking about 70% of Canadians go to a website first. That's the first thing they do before they do anything else. In the middle of the section, you're up pushing 90%. Of the people will check to see, does the community have a website? Does the manager have a website? Are there ratings that are provided by the renters that I can rely on as a substitute for going over there to have a look at it? And then they do look at industry experts or Yelp before they make that buy decision. And still, you know, social media's influence it's there, but it's not nearly as important as we've been led to believe. So, what did our renters say? 61% visited the company website or the project website before they went to go see it, 61%. And half of them said visiting that website was key to making a decision to rent there. So on the flip side, only 28% of respondents said that they live in communities with access to a community portal. And that's a portal that tells you about what's going on at the project. Major repairs or upgrades, how to save energy in terms of how you use your unit, what other activities are going on, like a social at the pool. And the tenants clearly reported that they like having community portals, and they want more information put online about their projects, both before they rent and as residents in place. So, what's really going on? It turns out that most communities do not have an online way of reporting needs that the tenants have, whether that's I'm getting a package later today, or I've got a leaky faucet, or whatever the issues are. Half of all renters said, in order to get a service request delivered, I got to do it in person. 54% said, I would prefer to do it by email. So that's a big gap. And if you don't have that functionality at your units, I would strongly recommend that you consider it, because that is also the thing in the comments section that people indicated annoy them most. So, having said that, 75% of the people said yes, they are satisfied, their service requests were taken care of, and 70% of them were satisfied in the amount of time that took. 56% said that the management kept them informed on where they were with the service request, but 54% of them would rather that communication be done online or via email. How did you find your rental? Now, this number, 35% in Canada, compares with 70% in the United States. So the trends are the same. This is almost double what these numbers were last year. So it is rising, and this is something that's really important, but over 3/4 of the young people under age 40, this was their primary method for how they found an apartment. So we did also ask which service did you use. Kijiji and View It were the most popular. So if you have a limited amount of staff time to set up and populate these websites, those are the two to focus on, because they seem to be the go-to resources for millennials. So payment. This is a huge increase from last year. Only 23% of the people were able to do online payments last year. It's now up to 47%. So now we're at a tipping point where if you don't have this fact, some people may be turned away, because there were about 17% of people who said that that's essential to them. We also asked about credit cards, just to see if that was another way that you could automate the payment, and that was not, it was not a highly desired category, and 83% of people said they wouldn't pay a service charge just to be able to do that. So it's really all about online e-commerce. We asked last year about Airbnb. Would that be a turnoff if people in your building were using Airbnb? And the answer was 8% of people said they did not want that last year. Today, it's 44%. So this is a trend also. This also matches the responses in large cities in America, and we've seen Vancouver, New York City, and San Francisco, and Seattle, I think, move in a direction where you cannot Airbnb your rental units as a technique for helping to avoid having units taken out of the market, because you can make so much more money by running your apartments as Airbnbs. So this is a big trend. These numbers have moved a lot just year over year, and I think that we will see these increase again next year. This was a new category. We didn't search for this last year. We were shocked at the responses. 60% of the renters said yes, they would use a package locker if it were provided. So we are just now seeing that traction in e-commerce, and this is something that I think landlords are not aware of, and it's a high value add in terms of the survey's contribution this year. 22% thought that perishable items should be attended to. So when you're at work and Amazon delivers your Whole Foods products, there'll be a place that they can be stored without perishing. So oversize also is an issue for landlords, because that requires additional space. And so as you're thinking about your business plan for next calendar year, putting this in would be highly appreciated by the respondents to our survey. So parking, I'm getting close to the end, so hang in there. Good news, 86% of respondents said there's sufficient parking on site for the building. 55% said there's plenty of guest parking, but 53% said they would pay for more parking. Since 40% of the respondents, and last year it was almost 50, said they don't own a car, same points that I made just a minute ago. If you do have parking and you feel like you have an oversupply of parking, you ought to go down and count those units and figure out how to rent them out, because a significant percentage of your residents would be willing to pay for extra parking. Before I go off that parking slide, we dropped this point, but the average amount that people would be willing to pay for extra parking was $50 a month. So it's meaningful. 53, I think, was the exact number. So again, that information can be toggled by location, urban, suburban, city, by age, all of that information. So as you're looking to monetize that, there's a lot of information in the survey that can help you. So technology conclusions, package delivery, who knew? Apps are not the way that this is happening. This is happening through newsletters. The community communications that are most effective are newsletters. Online payments and online communication, absolutely essential to have that. Company websites really matter. And the amount of people looking online is jumping astronomically year over year, like 100% just in the last year, according to our surveys. And the rental websites also matter. So if you don't do anything else, get on Kijiji and get on View It, and make those websites sharp, clear, have distinctive pictures, make sure there's multiple pictures of the unit in the community so that people can get a lot more information, because they'll just flip to the next project. And if you want more advice about that, I'm sure there's plenty of people here, and it might even come up later in the day, how to do a good website in order to drive traffic to your properties. So, on the opening, I talked a little bit about what's new for this year. Next year, we want to increase our penetration of the condo tenant response base, and we're working, and we'd be really interested in your ideas for how we reach those renters. Because we do put the survey on the rental websites, and then we have a number of apartment owners who helped us circulate it to their communities so that they would be able to get better information, including benchmarking, because they can actually do a subset of their own properties in comparison to their comp properties in the various cities. So that's another use of the thing. Increasing geographic reach, we really focused, you saw the numbers early days, I don't know how much you zeroed in on it. 4% of the responses were in London, 4% were in Hamilton. Those have a high student population, so we may be able to start getting some granularity about how student features or services might be different from the regular renter population, or maybe we have a whole subset because somebody who has a portfolio of student housing is interested in contributing that to the exercise of both obtaining the data and analyzing it. Same with seniors. So if you want to volunteer, please either tweet that information or leave your business card and information at the registration desk. We talked a little bit about the layout and common area and design features. We want to add that overlay, and we want to continue this focus on green and technological factors, because those are the ones that seem to be moving the most and are most valuable to the audience. So shout out to our sponsors. Can I get a round of applause? These are the people who put up the money so we could get this great data. I also want to personally shout out Sarah Siegel, who worked with all these landlords and pushed the surveys out, and she just killed herself to get this presentation together so I could give it to you today. So please volunteer to put your assets into the database. Help us get a higher response rate, especially in those smaller cities next year. If you've got some ideas about how to drive condos, or you've got some questions, burning questions, or if you think there were questions that weren't valuable, it'd be helpful if we could drop some questions so that we can add more content. So please leave your card at the registration desk, and thank you very much, and I'll be up here if you had any questions or wanted to learn more about the survey. Thanks so much.